Hello everyone, welcome to today's session where in the continuation of this series literary terms we are going to look at this literary genre war poetry. As the very name suggests that this poetry is related to war and poets have written a lot about the experiences of war since the times of Greeks, but it was these young soldier poets of the First World War who established war poetry as a literary genre, or we can say that it was their combined genuine efforts which became one of the defining texts of 20th century Europe. In the similar vein, we can take the definition of this term war poet. War poet is someone who participates in war and articulates his experiences of war in his poems, or it can be any non combatant person who writes about the experiences of war. So, this is a vague outline which I have tried to give to you related to war poetry and war poet. From the historical context, if we see, then war poetry is also known as trench poetry. Trench means any excavation or hole in the ground, and these trenches. It were these trenches where these soldiers used to reside or passed or stayed at most of the time during the warfare. So we can sense that how much critical circumstances they encountered, and in such a crucial or critical circumstance or in these tight compartments where they articulated their extreme emotions or their edgy experiences in the form of their poetry. If we see the phases of this poetry, or we divide this poetry as it transforms, so we can roughly divide this war poetry into two halves. First is when the world war broke out at the very outset, when this war was glorified as a noble affair. It was an issue of honor, or very question of their so-called honor, and war was projected as a very heroic deal, or it was just like the country was giving a chance to the young men of ennobling themselves. So it was in this picture the war was launched by all the countries and all the young men involved in this with such a patriotic fervor. So there was a heroic vision of sacrificing one's life for the sake of country or honor. So it was in this phase the poetry which was composed in this phase is known as early poetry, and it is sometimes also known as Georgian poetry, because it was the very similar time period when this Georgian poetry came into the existence. And this Georgian poetry was very romantic and idealistic in this in the tone, and the very same tone and mood, like heroic, artificial and bombastic manner we can see in this type of this early phase of war poetry, because it was very much affected by the Georgian poetry. And the prominent faces of this poetry are Rupert Brooke, Seeger and many more. And in this very session we will also discuss about this famous poet Rupert Brooke and his poetry. So this is something which is early poetry, early phase of war poetry. Next one is the later poetry, or we can say later phase of war poetry, and it was the poets who come in this body of later war poetry. They are more wiser and cynical in their tone, and wiser in the sense that now they have seen the very realistic face, the very traumatized and shocking face or image of this very romanticized war, and now they are more realistic in their tones. And as I read the statement, according to them, or the picture of war portrayed in this poetry is such: the war is brutal, vicious, meaningless, stupid, and barbarous. There was nothing honorable, glorious, or decorous about the war. So such was the change or shift we can perceive in this later poetry, and this is also termed as modern poetry due to its naturalistic and realistic portrayal of the situation, rather than singing the heroic in the heroic vein, idealistic vein, as such we have seen in the early phase of this poetry. And there is very there might be sometimes confusion about the notion of this war poetry, that it is something about the war or the glorifying of the war. But actually the real or the main body of war poetry is anti-war poetry, due to their uh, attack, because this was the poetry who projected an attack on those all the so-called ideologies of the nobleness of war. And it was in direct negation of this Georgian poetry. As I have told you that rather than romanticizing, they are presenting a very realistic picture of war. So that's why it is also called anti-war poetry. Actually it is anti-war poetry, and the famous figures of this specific body are like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg. Well, now let's have a brief discussion about some of the prominent or famous poets or war poets. And Rupert Brooke. Rupert Brooke is perhaps one of the famous patriotic poets who, like other patriotic poets, celebrated England's entry into World War First. And this is very obvious that we are going to find his verses are very patriotic. And he has also composed this, or he has also wrote this sonnet sequence titled 1941, in which the first sonnet was the peace and the last was the soldier. And in these 5 war sonnets, we find that he is eulogizing and he is singing the songs of hopeful idealism and the enthusiasm related to war, or enthusiasm related to sacrifice one's life into the one's life during the warfare. And these are the 3 lines which I have extracted from his famous poem The Soldier, in which he is imagining his own death, and rather than feeling fearful or sad, he is at such an affair that it is his death. Rather than feeling fearful or sad, he seems to accept this demise as a very proud moment, when he is able to sacrifice his life for the sake of his country. So such was the vein or patriotic fervor of these poets which Rupert Brooke represents. I read these lines for you. If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. Next one, the prominent war poet is Wilfred Owen. And as it was mentioned in the later phase of war poets, yes, Wilfred Owen was someone who wrote the verses against the war, as he himself was a soldier. And as per his experiences, we can find a very symbolic tone in his poem, which tells us the very futility of war. It is his poetry collection, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which means it is sweet and right to die for your country, and it is written in a very mocking tone, where he is satirizing the lies on the name of glorification of war. And in the preface of this very collection of poetry, he says that his poetry are the pity of war. And when there are many letters which he wrote during his stay on the front line, in which he has very well written about the futility or the senselessness or meaninglessness of war, rather than singing the songs of mighty, majesty, power, glory of the war. These letters suggest that what actually he felt during his stay on the front line. Next one, big figure in the series of war poets is Siegfried Sassoon, and I would like to read this that which is on the screen. He is one of the first Georgian writers, and though he was one of the Georgian writers, but he was also the one who was brave enough with a voice to describe war with its brutal realities as a means of destructive, horrific, and an indefensible waste of human lives. So we can say that he was someone who showed the mercilessness and the cold-blooded and the inhuman nature of this uh, trench warfare. And he was also someone who has very well depicted the dirty, filthy, and the painful nature of these trench warfare, as in his very famous poetry collection, Counter Attack and Other Poems, he has very skillfully delineated in a very effective anti-war uh, tone or attitude. He has very effectively depicted or portrayed the foul smelling rotting corpses, distorted limbs, filth and blood. So he was someone who can be said inspired many more war poets who communicated a very strong message of anti-war. And on the whole, we can say that yes, war poetry is and against the war in its vein, and there is a very clear cut break from the poetry which preceded it, and that was Georgian poetry. So that's all for today. See you in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.